Thank you.
All right, we'll get back to it. I believe Darren, you're our next moderator. I'm glad you're all working it out in the back of the room. That's good to know. We'll have you report out.
Martha Davis.
Yeah. Let's get back. Oh, somebody may need to grab her. I think Ed's doing it. All right. There we go. Great. Hi. Hi. Good morning.
Good morning.
Way.
Okay, I'm Darren Polhemus, Deputy Director here at the Water Board over Division of Financial Assistance, and I'll be moderating the second panel here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves as we go through the lineup, and they do their kind of intros like we did under Max's panel, so they'll all do 5-7 minute kind of start us off, and then as you can certainly ask questions along the way, and I'm stored up some myself here that will keep them peppered with, keep them hopping and keep them thinking. So we didn't Rochambeau to see who wanted to start first, but do you want to do the agenda order or the closest to me? Let's go to the agenda. So we'll start with Mr. Dove.
Good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present some thoughts here. I'm Douglas Dove with Bartle Wells Associates. I do a lot of cost of service, water and wastewater rate studies, and have worked all over the state for the last 25 years. So I bring perspective from the trenches. I want to just briefly talk a little bit about the conservation pricing versus cost of service conflict, surviving legal challenges, which are becoming more common now, getting to less water use to meet mandates. I'm going to talk briefly about rate tools and other options, and then what can the State Water Board do to help the public agencies. So first of all, the conservation pricing versus the cost of service. This is a big conflict. The day after the San Juan Capistrano case was decided, I got a bunch of calls from my clients saying, what do we do now? We have tiered rates. So, well, if your tiered rates are based on cost of service, you're fine. But a lot of them were based on a prior rate-making method where we allocated the cost to customer classes. And then within the customer class, for example, residential, we would develop tiers. And at the end of the day, the customer class would pay its full share of cost. But you know, the tiers will be developed to incentivize conservation. And so you end up with tiers that are low on the, low use and $8 to $10 per unit on the high use. Well, a lot of agencies, have a pretty simple water supply system. It's groundwater. And when they pump the groundwater, there's not a whole lot of difference in cost. And we can try to be creative and allocate conservation costs and peaking electricity costs and all that to the higher tiers. But at the end of the day, what we've been doing lately is taking nice 4-tier conservation-oriented rate structures and changing them to 2-tier, basically flat structures that are based on the cost divided by the volume. And so we're losing a lot of the conservation incentive from pricing. And this is a result of the legal challenge, and we're seeing more and more legal challenges to the rates. Rate challenges can now be class action lawsuits. So we're seeing attorneys go on contingency to go after public agency rates. I've got one agency that is being challenged. It's a real basic rate structure, but there's a former law professor who is also, he says, is a PhD in statistics challenging the cost of service that we developed. So that's getting really into the theoretical level of cost of service. And so I don't know where that's headed, but it seems like it may not be a wise use of public resources to fight all those lawsuits. So it would be nice if we could have some safe harbors in rate making where we could say, okay, we want to encourage conservation. Folks are using X times the average amount. Water supply is constrained. And so we would like to be able to charge a higher rate to discourage this. Right now, we can't do that because of the San Juan Capistrano fallout. Some of the tiered rates, some of the rate tools we're using include drought surcharges. As agencies are seeing drastic reductions in use, we need to make them whole so that they can stay financially whole. And so we're doing a lot of drought surcharges. This is just an overlay rate on top of existing rate structures. And in some agencies, especially affluent communities, the regular rates just are not high enough to induce significant conservation. So we've had to do penalties. These are not rates. These are penalties for violating conservation ordinances and going over allocations. And they have been very effective, and in some cases, cutting use up to 50% in the summertime. So that's a very effective tool. So I'd also like to talk a little bit about other options besides the pricing. We see, customers that can get information, really, if they can understand how much water they're using, that's a real help in getting them to conserve. I have to admit, I didn't really know how much I was using until this recent drought, and I took my water bill and divided it by the number of people in the house and said, oh, okay, I guess we're doing a pretty good job. But, I see technology as a real game changer. People getting on their smartphones updates as to what they're using so that they know. They can find out if they have a leak. And that, gives customers signals when they're really using at a high level. And that, I think most customers would, do something about that. What can the state board do to help? First of all, I think grants to agencies for that information technology so that they can get better information to the customers so they can conserve. Grants for water metering. I work with a number of agencies that don't even have water meters. So let's get water meters on everybody. And they want water meters, they just can't afford to install them right now. I think if we could develop a low-income program, maybe a surcharge statewide that could help low income, similar to what we have on the electric side. Water costs are going up much faster than inflation, and it's really difficult for folks to afford these bills. And so I think, efforts in the low-income area would be a big help. The state revolving fund loan is fantastic for water. It's really helping a lot of our clients to fund water projects, keep that coming. Possibly a public goods charge, just a small charge on a per unit basis to fund water conservation and affordability, not affordability, but water conservation and efficiency programs. I think that makes a lot of sense. As far as the consolidation of small agencies, I'm not a huge fan of consolidation. I think it makes sense when you have a small agency that cannot meet, treatment standards or other, they have consistent violations. But in general, I find that most small agencies are pretty well run. They're cost effective, and they represent their local communities. And to try to force them to join other larger agencies, I'm not sure what the benefit is. So I'm in favor of it when small agencies are not performing. But when they're meeting their mandates, I think they should be not consolidated. So with that, I will give it over to my next presenter.
One question, I assume when you say grants, you mean grants and low-interest loans.
Sure.
It could be either one. Okay.
Can I have a question just to illuminate something that you said? And that makes sense. I mean, in looking at communities that have a diverse set of sources, and particularly reliant on imported water, then it's easier to make the case for why it costs more when people are using more, because you got to go buy water, or you got to get more imported water, which is more expensive than local sources, or you got to do recycling or desal, or all those things that are going to cost more money as your community grows or as people use more. And so there's a decision to be made at a local level that's easier to articulate. But you raise the context of single community on a groundwater system where the costs aren't really differentiated. But aren't there, again, it's going to depend on the groundwater basin. You know, there are certain places where you got adjudications where if you use, you get your adjudicated amount, and if you use more, you got to pay through the nose for imported water to refill. I'm thinking in the San Gabriel Valley and some places. And so there would be a justification for why more water costs more, because, you know, very few groundwater basins are totally unlimited off towards the future. I mean, because shouldn't you be able to plan for the future for your community as well? You don't just get to drain it till it's dry or it stops, right?
Yeah, I think that's something that we would like clarification on. Can we charge a high rate for high use based on alternative supplies?
For alternative supplies,
Right.
or preserve the supply you have for future. So that's a question. I'm just putting it, Michael Loffer's writing it down. You know, where clarification, that seems to me to be a place where clarification is even, or the need for help is even more pronounced than in the average case. Okay.
Thank you. So next panel member is Ms. Heather Cooley, Pacific Institute.
Thank you. And is this the clicker that'll change? Yes. Okay.
Yes, it is.
It'll change, but it'll torture you. I'm just warning you.
Okay. Heather Cooley at Pacific Institute. I'm here today in my capacity as California Urban Water Conservation Council Board Chair. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the retail water pricing, BMP, and some of the recent changes that have been made and our process for making that. And I think you'll hear a lot of, Chair Marcus, a lot of the questions that you raised, you'll see that sort of reflected in the BMP. The Council has had a retail conservation pricing BMP since the beginning. There was a change in 2007, and that was what was alluded to earlier, the 70-30, 70% from the volumetric, 30 from fixed. Within that BMP, that revision was in 2007. At that time, there was also written into the BMP that after 5 years, there would be a review of the BMP to evaluate its effectiveness. We did initiate that review in 2012. We then had a series of discussions. It became clear that there was an interest in reviewing, potentially revising the BMP. We had several committees that met to talk about the technical aspects of that and what a revision might look like or a change. We also had another group look at more of the policy questions. How would we implement that? What would happen to the other options? So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what that committee did and what we came up with. When we first sort of launched our board committee, we had a discussion around what are the collective interests of groups 1 and 2. And it was a brainstorming session. There were a lot of ideas thrown out.
Explain groups 1 and 2 because most people don't know.
Within the council, there are sort of 3 groups. Group 1 is our water utility groups. Group 2 is the environmental and public interest groups. And then group 3 are our private entities, companies, consultants. Typically, when we make decisions on policy, it's between groups 1 and 2. They're the ones that sort of vote and negotiate the BMPs. So this board committee was made up of Group 1 and 2 members. We sort of met, again, to talk about what our collective interests are. I pulled those together and sort of organized them into 3 different groups. One were interests and concerns with rate setting in general. A second was around the BMP and what we thought it needed to address. The third were sort of broader council issues. So I'm going to talk about 2, the rate setting and the BMP. Within rate setting, there were a couple of factors that are typically considered in that process. One is around rates as a means of promoting water efficiency. Another is rates as a means of promoting water sustainability and the role of the utility as a water steward. We've obviously heard some of that. A second issue of consideration around rate setting is around financial stability and risk reduction. Another area is around equity. Equity within customer classes, across customer classes, and another issue, affordability, and we've heard some discussion around that. So rates sort of have to hit in all these areas. Another area is legal compliance, and specifically compliance with Prop 218. And then finally, rates have to play a role in integration across the utility, for example, between the conservation and the finance and senior management. So the rate setting process is complicated. There are a lot of factors that go into that process, and I think a lot of those, if not all of them, are really reflected here. In thinking about the BMP, we really wanted to develop a BMP that saved water. We wanted something that was a robust standard that reflected best practices, but we also wanted something that was flexible. We wanted to recognize that there are a lot of complexities in rate setting, as I just alluded to, that we have a diverse membership. We also wanted something that would recognize progress, that our process would not be too fast or too slow. And we also recognize that perfection is not possible, and you can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So we started here. We then worked together to develop another option, and this was an option that our members did recently approve. They approved it as a pilot program. I'll get a little more into that. But what I want to do is talk through the sort of different pieces of this option. We refer to it as the matrix. There's sort of 3 areas. So the first section of the matrix looks at retail water rate structure. And there are points awarded to different types of rate structures for different customer classes. So for uniform rates, you would get 1 point. For something that's 2 tiers or seasonal rates, there are 3 points available. And for 3 or more tiers or for allocation, there are 5 points available. We recognize that not every utility has every customer class, and we didn't want a utility to be penalized for that. So we allow them to distribute that based upon the percent of water delivered. And so your points would be allocated. So if all of your, if you only provided water to single-family residential and you had tiered pricing, then you would get 20 points in that category. There's a maximum of 20 points in Section 1. We did not try to get into how many tiers should you have, what are the increases in between tiers, how large should your tiers be. We really wanted to leave that to members. That's where you start getting into areas with Prop 218 compliance. We didn't get into that. But we did recognize that you can have some tiers that maybe aren't effective, and you could have some that are very effective. So we decided the way to look and think about that was using what we have here in Section 2 as a proportionality test. And a proportionality test is only applied to single-family residential, and essentially what you're doing is you're comparing the bill of a customer that uses twice as much water to another customer. You're comparing those bills, and depending on how you score, you would then get points. So if you score 2 on a proportionality, it implies that a customer using twice as much water is paying twice as much, and you would get 20 points for that. Alternatively, if your proportionality score is 1.2, then that would imply that a customer paying twice as much is only paying 20% more water. So to put a finer point on this, I have just a little bit of an example here. Again, these are sort of the scores for the different, or the points available for each of the different scores. You would simply look at the average volume of water used by a customer. In this case, it's 1 HCF. You would then look at the bill for the customer using 150% of average water volume. In this example, it was $80. You would then look at the bill of the customer using 75% of average water volume. In this example, $50. For your proportionality score, you would take the ratio, the $80 to $50, which is an equivalent to 1.6. You would then look up to your scoring. 1.6 would give you a score of 12 points. That would be your scoring for that particular case.
And the scoring means what? I'm sorry, I'm just having trouble following.
Yeah, so there's a score threshold that we came up with. A total score of 26 determines whether you're on track or off track. So if you're below 26, then you're not on track with the council's BMP. If you're 26 or above, you are on track.
So and if you're not on track, it means you're not incentivizing conservation, or that you're not covering your cost?
No, it doesn't look at, it determines whether or not you are on track with the council's best management practice.
And the best management practice is geared towards incentivizing conservation.
Efficiency, exactly.
And the entity that receives the score is the agency.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, it's the council members, yes. Okay, so those are the two sections, section 1 on the rate structure where you would get points, section 2 on this proportionality score. The third and final section really looks at what we refer to as conservation enhancements. These are things other than rates that can help incentivize and promote efficiency. I'm not going to, there are about 16 of them here. I'm not going to go through every one of them.
I want to at least say them all because there's some people listening versus looking.
Okay.
There's good stuff on this.
Okay, so there are sort of 4 broad categories. First is around billing, and these were some of the issues that were brought up earlier. If you are sending bill more frequently on a monthly basis, you can get a point for that, as opposed to every other month or quarterly. There are things related to the bill format. If you're providing information in the bill in units customers typically understand, like gallons, there is a point for that. The second area is in and around metering, points available for requirements for dedicated irrigation meters, for sub-metering for either commercial or multifamily, and for the use of either AMR or AMI to provide information to customers for things such as leaks or high bills or other types of warnings. Another important area that can help to sort of enhance that price signal is in and around communications, and we've talked a little bit about that. If you provide website tools or use histories or some form of benchmarking, that's another way of communicating with your customer about not only price, but about use and efficiency. And finally, we wanted to promote and incentivize innovations. Things like the Davis model that was talked about earlier. We would provide a point for something like that. It doesn't have to be that particular one, but we recognize that we don't know everything to know about rates, and we want people to innovate. Another is in around fees and credits, looking at a connection fee structure, for example, that incentivizes low water use. Maybe there's a rebate or an incentive if you have a lower water use. A third area was in and around drought and shortage response. If you have a drought surcharge, we want to encourage that. Obviously, we are seeing some of the issues and challenges associated with reductions in demand. So that's another area where we would provide points. As I mentioned, the sort of total point threshold is 26. You can't get that in any one section. In each section, the maximum points was less than that. We do not anticipate that anybody is going to have all of these points. That is not our intent at all, but we did want to provide some flexibility. So just to sort of wrap it up, some of the advantages of this approach is that the calculations are fairly simple and the math is straightforward. We do provide members with a tool. They don't have to do the calculation of points. They just add in information about their rate structures and the volume. It's very flexible. There are a lot of different ways to get points. It's not just a one sort of pass-fail calculation. Another area is that it's very forward-looking. It applies to rates and practices that are adopted rather than revenues received, which can vary. Agency performance is not really subject to external forces like the drought. So of course, as we see demand go down, that's going to change that mix between fixed and variable. This tool is really doesn't change in that respect. And it's very comprehensive. It has what we think are important aspects of rate setting, but it's not just looking at sort of the source of revenue. So I'll stop there if you have any questions. To reiterate that the council membership did approve this just a couple of weeks ago. It's a pilot. We'll be running it. It's effective immediately, so they can use it for 2013 and 2014, and again for 2015 and 2016. In 2017, we'll review the information and the data, and just decide together, as we always do, about what the future course will be with that particular BMP.
So it's looking ahead scoring, but have you done any quick review of percentage of your membership that would reach the 26 points?
Thank you. I was remiss in not speaking to that. We did have some information. I think as Max pointed out, information is lacking on rate structures. We do, though, have some information from council members, and we did a process of looking at about 50 or 55 members and how they would score, at least on the first two sections. On the enhancements, there is really no sort of centralized place to get that information. We then set that score of 26 based on the average, one standard deviation below the average for members. So we saw members scoring very well, and we thought that was a score that really spoke to what members, it was achievable, yet it was still something that members could be working towards. One of the things we really liked is that, in my mind, the matrix really helps to identify a path forward. It tries to highlight what are some things you can do to help improve the price signal and to help using rate structures and pricing as one tool in the toolbox.
Very helpful, particularly with engineering-based organizations. So I think the tool is better than a story-based format, which would be more my legal approach. I think that makes sense. Can you remind me, I know I should know this from knowing the council, what percentage of the urban water agencies in California are members? Of the 411 big ones, what percentage are members of the council? So what's your total number, actually?
Yeah, if Greg Weber is in the room, I don't have the number off the top of my head. My sense is that it's more than 80%, and he's on his way up right now.
That's the button.
Hi, Greg Weber from the Urban Water Conservation Council. I can give you raw numbers, and then there's a variety of ways you might calculate percentage. In terms of the major wholesalers, 19 have signed, and they represent about 90% of the deliveries to the urban water sector. In terms of retail members, and this includes investor-owned utilities, we have approximately 250. So that's, I think our retail members, last time I looked, supply about 45% of the water to the urban sector in California.
Thank you. So that's substantial. Questions?
Okay. We'll move to our third panel member here. Mr. Baron Clow from UC Riverside.
Morning, and thank you for having me here today.
That's right. You can respond to anything said about you, but no mean things to say about Ellen. You
No, I
can't
can
drum her out of
respond.
the Economist Club.
Now, I was going to set the record straight and say, even if I had the authority, I would never kick Ellen out of the club.
There you go. Good. That's good.
But again, thank you for having me here. I'm an economist at UC Riverside in the School of Public Policy, and I was asked to come speak briefly today about some research results that we've generated over the past roughly 3 years or so related to allocation-based rates. And I wanted to start by sort of telling you what I'm going to talk about, what I'm not going to talk about. We've heard other people mention today that when we think about rate setting, we often think of 3 different, sometimes competing goals of conservation, affordability, and fiscal stability. And I'm going to present results related to the first 2 today, conservation and affordability. We have not looked in depth at fiscal stability of these rate structures, and I will leave comments on that topic to general managers and finance managers who understand that much better than I do. But I can say that in my discussions with these people, I'm getting a very broad positive sense of how the outcomes have been on the financial side. But the research that I've done with Kurt Schwabe and Ariel Dinar at UC Riverside examines, as I said, conservation and affordability in the context of allocation-based rates. And today I'm going to present some research results on those 2 topics and also talk about the data needs that we encountered when we were doing those studies. So just a few slides to kind of visualize the research results here, and I'll talk over these to explain what you're seeing. Both of these studies were conducted using data that covers the period of time before and after Eastern Municipal Water District switched from uniform rates to allocation-based rates in April of 2009. Eastern switched from a uniform rate to a 4-block rate structure, and last I checked, the lowest block was priced at about $1.80 per CCF, and the highest was over $10 per CCF, and I would characterize that as a pretty steeply inclining rate structure. That's a pretty big difference between the bottom and the top rate. They observed a pretty significant reduction in demand after that rate structure change, but they didn't know how much was due to the rate structure itself. And so they asked us to conduct a study for them. And basically what we did was we identified about 13,000 households that had continuous tenancy during this time period, going back to 2003. And we estimated a statistical model that would basically allow us to predict demand under different conditions, like different price conditions, different weather conditions, different income conditions. And we used that model, which fit the data quite well, to predict how high demand would have been among this sample of customers if Eastern had not adopted this allocation-based rate structure in April of 2009, but if instead they had kept their old uniform rate structure and they had set their prices equal to the average prices that households were paying under that allocation-based rate structure. So we think of that as an equivalent uniform rate structure. The average price paid is the same across those 2 rate structures. And we account for household characteristics, demographics, income changes, weather changes. And what we end up deriving, that you can see on this slide here, is the difference between where we think demand would have been under that uniform rate structure and where it actually was under the allocation-based rate structure for different subsamples of our group of 13,000 households. And I've broken it out here by the full sample in yellow, the 1/3 of the most inefficient water users in red, the average third in green, and the most efficient third in blue. So a couple observations on this. What you can see is that, first of all, it took some time for this rate effect to develop. You have to go about 2 years after the rate structure change before you see at least a 10% decrease in demand that we believe is attributable to the rate structure itself, not the price level, not weather, not income changes, but the rate structure itself. And then after that, roughly mid-2011, you see that it's kind of bounced around in the 10 to 15% range. And so that's one of the takeaway messages of the research, is that we think their rate structure achieved roughly a 10 to 15% reduction in demand beyond where demand would have been under that equivalent uniform rate structure, simply due to the inclining block rate structure. The other thing you can see here is that the effect was much larger on the inefficient households than it was on the efficient households. The inefficient households, the last time we checked the data, which was back about roughly a year ago, they were 25 to 30% below where we think their consumption would have been under uniform rates, whereas the efficient households had rebounded a bit, and they were maybe only 5% below where we think they were. So the effect was targeted, as it was intended to be, on the most inefficient households in our sample. A couple other observations regarding affordability now. We can break out different income groups in our sample. And one thing that we were able to show was that the average prices paid by the lower 1/3 of the income distribution and also the lower one-third in terms of usage in our sample. The average prices paid within those two groups actually decreased as a result of this rate structure change. But the average water consumption also decreased. And we believe that the rationale there is the fear of getting into those higher tiers causes people to reduce demand even though they observed average price going down. So it's this high marginal price that's really driving reductions in demand. So you could argue that some additional affordability was achieved here because average prices went down for the lowest income households, and they still responded with increased conservation. So that's an additional positive result out of this rate structure change.
How do you, and it's probably very complex and would take a long time, but how do you break out the distinction about price versus just obviously the education that Eastern did tremendously, because it had to do that education in order to move to the allocation-based rate structure, which is at its heart a community decision about what's reasonable?
So it's a great point, and we do try to capture salient features in a multivariable regression model, but we're not able to say exactly what it was about the rate structure change that might have contributed to different proportions of the reduction. What we're observing here is an event, which was the rate structure change. We're comparing it to this hypothetical alternative, which was sticking with the status quo, but adjusting the price to make sure that we're making hopefully a fair comparison. But we can't say if Eastern had taken a different approach to messaging, how this would have been different. I can tell you that the one bit of information we do have about that is we can see in our data that when Eastern asked their customers to please conserve water temporarily because maybe there is maintenance going on in their area, we can actually observe about a 5% drop in that month when that message was sent out. But that's really the only thing I can say about that. Yeah. One other thing I would say in terms of affordability is that we can use this model to figure out, well, how high would you have to raise prices, your uniform prices, in order to get this similar demand effect? So in real terms, the average price only went up across our full sample by about 3% during this time period. But we estimate that Eastern would have had to raise the real price of water by 30% to get the same observed reduction in demand that we see here in this sample due to allocation-based rates. So again, you're getting a big conservation signal, you're getting a big drop in demand, but your overall price level, your average price paid for each unit of water is only going up a tenth of what it would have to go up under uniform prices to get the same result. And that's good news for customers, right?
That's in part because of the conversation that has to take place in order to do an allocation-based rate, or because it just sends a clearer signal about what's cool and what's not?
Well, I can speculate, and as an economist, I'm going to say prices are important, right? But when you talk
I want to get drummed out of the club.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
As long as there's going to be a vote, I want to stay in. But when you talk to people at Eastern, they really do emphasize the effort that was made to reach out to customers and educate them and communicate with them. I can't tell you for sure which one played a bigger role or how much, though. Yeah.
Did you determine that 30%?
How did we determine that? We used our model, and we started raising the price variable in our model, and we raised it up as high as it needed to get before we saw the same reductions that we observed in the actual data.
You have to have huge sticker shock.
Would have been, I think.
For it to take effect.
And it's interesting you mentioned that because you also hear stories from folks at Eastern and other agencies too about anticipated sticker shock of moving to allocation-based rates. And then kind of the opposite, which is, my bill went down, right? And that doesn't happen across the board, but it does happen for a lot of households, that if they were already efficient, this actually turns out quite well for them, and that's actually what I'll talk about next. Feel free to interrupt with other questions.
So that's great. No, we've been finding that in just anecdotally in conversations that sometimes people assume that any new thing is going to hurt them. That's
Bad, right.
a common human impact. And then once you have a conversation, you realize, well, actually not. I even had to have a conversation with a community that was upset about our regs for small communities because they couldn't meet 25. And I said, well, you could also just limit watering to twice a week. They said, well, we don't have lawns. And I said, you could limit watering to twice a week.
That's good.
Did you look at the cost of, or did the agency look at its costs before they went to allocation-based rates and then the cost after they went to allocation-based rates? Did you look at those costs at all?
Like a per unit supply cost or cost
I'm
of
just,
switching?
my question is, you know, as a utility starts to move in this direction, can they make the assumption that they will not need to increase their personnel, for example, or, you know, have a bigger budget for communications, or there is a cost there that is not just serving water.
Right. We did not look at that. And I know that there are some general managers in the room here today. Maybe it would be a great question for them to respond to about what types of efforts they had to ramp up in anticipation. I do know there are real upfront financial costs, but I've also heard that since some of the earlier adopters did this, the perception of those costs has come down, and which is to be expected, that we'll learn from what we did, we'll become more efficient about it, and the costs will be lower for people who adopt later.
Part of the, you know, many purposes, part of the purpose of this meeting is also to help put on deck some of those factors so people can talk to each other.